The morning Eleanor Voss received the notice, the fire in the cottage sitting room had gone cold. She had not noticed it go out. She was standing at the writing desk near the window, the letter already open in her hand, and the words on the page were so precisely composed, so careful in their legal architecture, that she read them twice before she understood that the precision was the cruelty. Mr. Aldous Fenwick had not written in anger. He had written in the language of property management, of orderly transition, of a settlement that, as he phrased it, awaited its natural conclusion. Eleanor was the conclusion. She had 3 days. She set the letter on the desk and looked out at the garden. The roses along the far wall were still in their late autumn colour, a deep and stubborn red that had no interest in the season's opinion. She had planted those roses herself, the spring after Thomas died, pressing the roots into the earth with her own hands because the gardener had gone to tend the main house, and she had not wanted to wait. 3 days. She folded the letter along its original crease, set it beneath the small stone paperweight Thomas had brought her from the Derbyshire hills, and went to lay the fire herself. That had been the 1st of October. The notice gave her until the 4th. 18 months had passed since Thomas Voss died of a fever that no physician had been able to name, and no amount of wealth had been able to slow. He had been a quiet man, her husband, without particular cruelty or particular warmth, and Eleanor had learned early in their marriage not to mistake the absence of the one for the presence of the other. What he had given her was this cottage, or so she had believed. A clause in the marriage settlement, written in the careful hand of his father's solicitor, had stipulated 1/3 of the annual cottage yield as Eleanor's widow's portion. She had never asked whether the cottage itself was secured to her. It had not occurred to her to ask. Thomas was alive. Then Thomas was not alive. Then 18 months had passed in quiet grief and steady work, and now Fenwick's letter lay beneath the Derbyshire paperweight, and the roses were red, and Eleanor was building a fire at 8 in the morning, because no one else was going to do it. Mrs. Agnes Pratt arrived at 8:30 with the bread and the week's accounts, as she had every Monday morning for 4 years. She was a compact woman in her early 60s, with grey hair that she wore in a severe arrangement that somehow softened as the day went on, and she had the housekeeper's practiced gift of noticing everything without appearing to notice anything at all. She set the bread on the kitchen table, laid the accounts beside it, and looked at Eleanor's face. She did not ask about the letter. Eleanor had not shown it to her. Agnes was simply the kind of woman who could read a room the way a physician reads a wrist. "The water's heating," Agnes said, which meant, "Sit down and I will bring it to you, and we will speak of practical things until you are ready to speak of the rest." Eleanor sat down. The accounts were in good order. They were always in good order because Eleanor kept them herself, in a small ledger bound in brown calfskin that Thomas had purchased for the household but never opened. She understood money. She understood it the way women who have never had quite enough of it learn to understand it, as a language in which every word is a weight. The widow's portion was clear in the settlement. 1/3 of the cottage's annual yield, which in the past year had amounted to £44. It was not a fortune. It was enough to be dignified on, which was not nothing. What was not clear, apparently, was whether that portion obligated the Voss estate to leave the cottage itself in Eleanor's possession. Fenwick's letter did not argue this point so much as assume it. The cottage, he wrote, would revert to the estate at the conclusion of the widow's temporary tenure. Temporary. As if the 4 years she had spent making that garden and keeping those accounts and pressing those rose roots into that particular soil had always been understood as provisional. She drank her tea. She read the accounts. She did not collapse. The second morning, a Tuesday, she was in the library when she heard the sound of wheels on the gravel drive. The cottage had a library, which was one of the things Eleanor had loved about it. A room of modest dimensions at the back of the ground floor, with shelves that ran floor to ceiling on two walls and a single window that faced the garden. Thomas had stocked the shelves mostly with agricultural reports and bound copies of county records. Eleanor had added novels, natural philosophy, 3 volumes of Italian verse she could read with reasonable fluency, and a well-worn copy of Blackstone's commentaries that she had borrowed from the estate's main library 2 years ago and not returned. She heard the wheels on the gravel and felt the small, precise contraction that had lived in her chest since Monday morning. Then she heard Agnes's voice at the front door, composed and careful as always, and a man's voice she did not recognize, low and unhurried, explaining something in a few measured words. She waited. Agnes appeared at the library threshold a moment later. "A Mr. Hartwell, miss, from the estate, says he's been sent to survey the property. Has a letter from Fenwick's office." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. A surveyor. Of course, Fenwick would want a valuation before he presented the cottage formally to Lady Miriam's preferred buyer, whoever that was. Of course, there would be a surveyor. The letter had said 3 days, and the second day had barely begun, and already the machinery of displacement was running on its careful schedule. "Send him in," she said. He was not what she expected. She had expected a small, efficient man with ink on his fingers, and the slightly distracted manner of someone perpetually in the middle of a calculation. What came through the library door was a tall man in a coat that had seen better seasons, plain dark wool with a collar that sat perhaps a degree too well for the coat's general state, carrying a leather satchel and a measuring rod. He was somewhere in his mid-30s with dark hair that had begun to dry unevenly from the morning rain, and he held himself with a kind of settled stillness that was either the quietness of a man accustomed to his own company or something else entirely, though Eleanor could not have said what the something else might be. He stopped at the threshold, looked at the room, and then looked at her. Not with the brisk assessing glance of a working man taking stock, but with the particular quality of attention a person gives when they are genuinely in the presence of something they had not anticipated. "Miss Voss," he said, then corrected himself, very slightly. "Mrs. Voss, forgive the intrusion." "You are not intruding," Eleanor said. "You are expected, more or less. I assume you need the library as well." "If it is not an inconvenience." "I was reading." She closed the Blackstone and moved it to the far end of the desk to make room. "You may work here. I'll have Agnes bring tea when the kettle is ready." He looked at her for a beat longer than the exchange strictly required. Then he set his satchel on the small table near the window and began to unpack it with the efficient quiet of someone who knew how to work in a space without disturbing it. Agnes brought tea. Eleanor returned to the accounts she had been reviewing alongside the Blackstone, because she had been cross-referencing the widow's portion language with what Blackstone said about dower rights, and she was not going to set that task aside simply because the estate had sent a man to measure the rooms she was in the process of arguing she had the right to keep. She was aware of him peripherally as she worked, the scratch of his pencil on the measuring notes, the soft sound of the measuring rod against the skirting boards, the occasional pause when he made a notation in a small book he drew from the satchel. He did not speak to her unnecessarily. He did not perform the labouring man's self-conscious awkwardness in a room that belonged to his social better, nor did he perform the easy confidence of a man who had decided the room already belonged to him. He simply worked, with a competence and economy that she found, despite everything, less irritating than she had anticipated. At 10:30 she looked up from the accounts. "You'll find the east-facing rooms damp in autumn," she said. There is a problem with the guttering that has been reported to the estate twice in the past year and not addressed. He looked up from his notes. Which rooms? The second bedchamber and the passage outside the linen press. He made a notation. Thank you. It does not affect the valuations you are likely making, she said. The walls are sound. It is a guttering problem, not a structural one. I note it because you should know the truth of the property rather than what a quick survey in dry weather might suggest. He held her gaze for a moment. I appreciate that. She returned to the accounts. After a moment he said, still looking at his notebook, You manage the household accounts yourself. It was not quite a question. I do, she said. And the garden? Yes. I noticed, he said, when I came up the drive, that the roses along the south wall are a variety I have not seen before in this part of the county. They are still in colour. Eleanor set down her pen. They are maiden's blush, from a cutting my grandmother kept. They are not fashionable. They are simply very hardy. He did not smile precisely, but something shifted in the arrangement of his expression, and it had the quality of a door opening onto a room where the fire was already lit. The rain returned in the late morning, harder than before, and the surveying of the external grounds became impossible. He worked his way methodically through the upper floor, and Eleanor heard the measuring rod at intervals through the ceiling of the library, a steady, soft percussion that she found herself timing without meaning to. When it stopped, she knew he was making notations. When it resumed, she knew he had reached a new room. She went to make more tea herself, because Agnes had gone to the village on the errand of provisions that could not be deferred any longer regardless of circumstances, and because Eleanor found that she did not mind the task. She set the kettle and stood at the kitchen window looking at the rain in the garden. The roses were taking it without difficulty, the deep red deepening further in the wet. He appeared in the kitchen doorway and stopped. I did not know the housekeeper had gone, he said. She has not gone permanently, Eleanor said, with a composure that surprised her slightly given the quality of the morning. She will be back by noon. I am quite capable of making tea. I did not suggest otherwise. Sit down, Mr. Hartwell. He sat. She made the tea. Outside, the rain ran in long, straight lines past the kitchen window, and the sound of it against the glass was the only sound in the room for a moment, and Eleanor was aware in that moment of the strangeness of the day. She was 2 days from a forced departure. She was making tea for the man the estate had sent, to value what she was losing. And there was something in the air of that kitchen, in the rain and the warmth of the stove and the ordinary domestic weight of 2 people sitting with a pot between them, that felt entirely unlike any moment she had experienced in the 18 months since Thomas died. She set his cup down. She sat across from him. Outside the window, the roses held their colour through the rain. Do you survey estates often? She asked. It was a polite question, the sort of question asked across a kitchen table to maintain the civil distance that the situation required. He looked at his cup for a moment. Often enough, he said. Then, after a pause, not always with the same purpose. What other purposes are there? Understanding, he said simply, what a property is, rather than what it is worth. She considered that. Those are generally the same question in my experience. They are the same question asked by different people, he said, and she could not quite decide whether that was an observation or a correction, and decided it was probably both. Agnes returned at 12:20 with the provisions, and with the particular watchful expression she wore when she was absorbing information that she would later organize and present in her own time. She looked at them seated at the kitchen table, looked at the tea things, and said nothing at all, which was itself a form of speaking. The afternoon was spent in adjacent rooms, Eleanor in the library, James at the writing table in the adjoining parlour, which he had asked permission to use for the drawing up of his preliminary notes. The door between them stood open. Eleanor could hear him turning pages and occasionally setting his pen down, and the sound of rain against the parlour window, and then the pen resuming. He was working steadily, unhurriedly, with the concentrated economy of someone to whom precision mattered for its own sake, rather than because anyone was watching. She found the Blackstone more difficult to concentrate on than it had been in the morning. She crossed to the parlour once to retrieve a letter she had left on the side table, and he looked up from his notes. She saw, before he covered them with his arm in a gesture that was not quite deliberate, but almost, that the page open before him was not a valuation form. It was a letter. She could not read the heading. He smoothed his notes over it with a naturalness that might have been entirely innocent, and she told herself that it was, and returned to the library. By 4 o'clock the light had gone flat and grey, and the rain was a steady, settled presence rather than an event. Agnes brought candles and disappeared again, and Eleanor was standing at the library window looking out at the garden when she heard him stop in the doorway behind her. She did not turn. "I will be finished with the upper rooms tomorrow," he said. "Before 9, she said. "Fenwick arrives at 9. A pause. "I know." She turned then, because his voice had a quality in those 2 words that warranted turning toward. He was standing in the doorway with the candle from the parlour in his hand, and the light of it put a warmth along his jaw that the grey afternoon had not permitted. And he was looking at her with that quality of attention she had noticed in the library that morning and had been, with imperfect success, not thinking about since. "Then you have your deadline as well," she said. "I do," he agreed. She held his gaze for a moment. Outside, the garden was barely visible, only the line of the south wall and, barely, the roses, which were now only a dark shape against the darker stone. "Good night, Mr. Hartwell," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Voss." She woke very early on the 3rd morning, before full light, with the knowledge of what the day contained sitting in her chest, like a stone that had been placed there quietly in the night. She dressed without hurrying. She washed her face at the basin. She looked at her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand, the face she had looked at every morning for 31 years, and found it composed, which was not nothing. She had not slept well. The overheard conversation from the evening before had seen to that. It had happened at 7:15 when she came down the back stairs to ask Agnes about the supper arrangement. The study door at the foot of the stairs had been open perhaps 2 inches, and inside it Fenwick had been speaking with Lady Miriam Voss, who had arrived without announcement at 6, and installed herself in the study with the authority of a woman who had never in her life believed she required announcement. Eleanor had not heard the beginning of the conversation. She had heard enough. "The widow's portion is not the point," Lady Miriam said, her voice carrying the bored precision it always carried when she was explaining something she felt should require no explanation. "I do not dispute the widow's portion. She may have her £44. The cottage is estate property and always has been, and my patience with this arrangement has extended considerably past any reasonable duration." "She has made no formal claim to the property," Fenwick said. "She has made no formal departure either. 3 days were quite sufficient for that indication." "Lady Miriam," Fenwick's voice was carefully calibrated between professional counsel and personal reluctance. "If she were to apply to the trustees directly, the settlement's language on widow's occupation could be construed as—" "I am aware of what it could be construed as," Lady Miriam said, with the clipped dismissal of someone changing a subject by force of social authority. "That is precisely why we are here, and precisely why this arrangement must conclude before she has the opportunity to write letters to anyone. She is to be gone by noon tomorrow." A pause. "There is also the matter," Fenwick said more carefully, "of Mr. Aldous Carrington. Eleanor had gone very still on the stairs. "Mr. Carrington is a suitable match," Lady Miriam said. "He has expressed an interest that I see no reason to discourage. Eleanor's continued residence here, and her continued—" She paused, and Eleanor heard the precise calibration of what followed. "Independence of disposition have been an impediment to that arrangement reaching a natural conclusion. Once she is removed from this cottage and placed in a position of genuine dependency, she will see matters more sensibly." Eleanor stood on the back stairs and listened to the woman who had organized her displacement explain that the displacement was not about property law at all. It was about a match that Eleanor had never agreed to consider, with a man she had met precisely twice, arranged by a woman who had never in Eleanor's experience asked for anything she did not intend to take. She had gone back up the stairs. She had not slept. What she had done, at the writing desk at 11 o'clock that night, with a single candle burning and the house quiet around her, was write a letter to the estate trustees at the firm of Hartwell and Green in London. She had written carefully and without anger. She had cited the relevant clause of the marriage settlement. She had cited Blackstone's discussion of widows' right of habitation as a recognized common law principle, distinguishable from dower, but no less established in its application. She had noted the specific language of Thomas's settlement, the specific annual yield figure, and the fact that Fenwick's notice had been issued without formal hearing or trustee authorization. She had asked nothing more than that the trustees review the matter before any formal transfer of possession was executed. She had signed it, Eleanor Voss, widow of Thomas Voss of Ashford Cottage, Derbyshire, and she had sealed it with the plain red wax she kept in the middle drawer of the writing desk. She had addressed it to the firm. She had not asked James Hartwell to take it. She had not asked him for anything. Now she came downstairs in the early morning of the third day, and the sitting room was lit by the pale particular light of a day that has not yet decided what it intends to be. Agnes was already in the kitchen, moving with the slightly fiercer efficiency she reserved for mornings when she was angry on Eleanor's behalf, which was to say she was currently putting the kettle on with a degree of resolution that the kettle had not earned. James came downstairs at 7. He was dressed with a precision that went several degrees past what his coat warranted, and he had the contained manner of a man who had decided something in the night and was not yet in circumstances where he could act on it. He sat across from Eleanor at the kitchen table and accepted his tea and looked at the sealed letter beside her cup. "You wrote to the trustees," he said. "Last night, yes. May I ask what you cited?" "Blackstone, the settlement language, the lack of trustee authorization for Fenwick's notice." He was quiet for a moment. "It is a sound argument." "I know," she said. "I have been reading the commentaries for 4 days. It is sound, and it is probably not sufficient, because the trustees are not inclined to inconvenience Lady Miriam on the grounds of a principle that no one has tested. And because—" She stopped. She set down her cup. She looked at the sealed letter. "Because endurance by itself does not constitute a legal claim, and I have been confusing those two things for 18 months. He said nothing. She was grateful for it. "I am not expecting the letter to save me," she said quietly. "I am writing it because it is the true thing to do, and because if I leave without having made the argument I have to make, I will have participated in my own erasure. That is something I am not willing to do." Outside, the morning light was strengthening across the garden. The roses along the south wall were just coming visible, that deep, stubborn red. And for a moment, the kitchen was entirely still, only the sound of the kettle beginning its low preliminary note on the stove. And Eleanor thought that if this was the last morning she would see them, she would at least see them properly. She looked up, and found him watching her with an expression she had no name for. Not pity. Pity would have been far easier to dismiss. "Eleanor," he said, and the use of her Christian name without preface or apology was so quiet and so deliberate that she felt it land in a place below ordinary articulation, somewhere in the chest where things land when they are true. He stopped. He looked at the sealed letter. He said, "There is something I should tell you." She waited. "Not yet," he said, and she heard in those two words a restraint that cost him something, though she could not have said what. "Not this morning, before Fenwick arrives." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then you had better be quick about it," she said, "because Fenwick arrives at 9. He did not answer that. He drank his tea, and the morning moved on. Fenwick's carriage came up the drive at 8 minutes past 9, which was characteristic. He was a man who respected the appearance of punctuality rather than punctuality itself, arriving close enough to the appointed hour to avoid criticism, and late enough to convey that his time was worth more than the appointment's strict demands. Behind his carriage came a second vehicle, plainer and closed, and from it descended Lady Miriam Voss, in a travelling coat of deep charcoal grey that was impeccably cut and entirely appropriate for the occasion of evicting a widow from her home. Eleanor stood at the front door of the cottage. She had put on her better grey dress, the one with the black velvet at the cuffs that Thomas had liked, not because she was performing grief, but because she believed one ought to be well dressed for the things that mattered. Agnes stood 3 steps behind her with the rigid back of a woman who has decided that if she is required to witness this proceeding, she will witness it in the posture of a grenadier. James had gone out to the garden some 20 minutes before, and she did not know precisely where he had gone or why. Fenwick descended first, adjusted his hat, and came up the front path with the brisk forward motion of a man carrying out an unpleasant errand he had been professionally reconciled to. Lady Miriam followed, moving with the measured authority she always moved with, the gravity of a woman whose social certainty was so deeply established that it had ceased to require any visible effort. "Mrs. Voss," Fenwick said. "Mr. Fenwick," Eleanor said. "Lady Miriam." Lady Miriam looked at her steadily. There was nothing deliberately unkind in her expression, which was almost worse than if there had been. It was the expression of a woman looking at a practical problem that had taken longer than it should to resolve. "I trust," she said, "that the morning finds you in order." "Perfectly, thank you," Eleanor said. The gravel crunched behind both of them. Eleanor looked past Fenwick's shoulder and saw a rider coming up the drive at a steady pace. A broad-shouldered man on a bay horse who wore the look of a country landowner heading toward a social call rather than an urgency. He raised a hand as he reached the gatepost and guided his horse to the side of the drive, dismounting with the easy competence of someone who had been doing it since childhood. "Hartwell," the man said cheerfully, looking past Eleanor and Fenwick entirely toward the garden beyond. "Hartwell? By God, is that you? I saw the survey reports at the county office last week and wondered if you'd be down this way." Eleanor did not move. Fenwick had gone very still beside her. James came around the side of the cottage from the garden, and he had removed his coat, and his cravat was somewhat less than perfectly arranged from the morning. And he walked up the drive toward the man on the bay horse with the unhurried ease of someone crossing territory that he is entirely comfortable in. "Whitmore," he said. "I didn't know you'd taken to surveying your own properties personally," the man called Whitmore said, and his tone was the cheerful, unself-conscious tone of a man who sees nothing unusual in the sentence he has just spoken. "Didn't you say at Harrogate that you left that sort of thing to agents?" James stopped on the drive, equidistant between Eleanor and Whitmore. He looked at Whitmore with a stillness that was not quite warning, but Whitmore, who was already swinging his attention toward Fenwick, missed it entirely. "Forgive me," Whitmore said to the party at large, pulling off his hat. "I am Whitmore, of Falklands Park. I expect I have interrupted something. I only stopped because I recognized my lord's horse at the gatepost." "My lord." Lady Miriam turned from Eleanor to James with the slow, controlled precision of a woman whose internal architecture is revising itself under considerable pressure and refusing to show the effort it costs. Fenwick said, very quietly, "Mr. Hartwell?" James looked at him. The coat that had seen better seasons, the measuring rod somewhere in the library, the leather satchel, the 2 days of methodical, careful survey. And, beneath all of it, the stillness that had never quite fitted the circumstances. Eleanor looked at his hands, which were quiet at his sides, and at the way he stood on the drive of the cottage he had been pretending to assess for a woman he had been pretending to work for. And she felt the understanding arrive, not as a shock, but as the recognition of something she had been refusing to name since the first morning in the library. "My name is James Hartwell," he said, not to Fenwick, not to Whitmore, but to Eleanor, in a voice that was entirely level and entirely direct. "I am the Earl of Ashford. This estate, including this cottage, was entailed to me through the Hartwell succession on the death of my cousin, which occurred 3 months before Thomas Voss died. Fenwick's authority to issue the eviction notice derived from an arrangement with the Voss family solicitors that was never properly communicated to my estate office, and which has no legal foundation of which I have yet been made aware." Eleanor heard Agnes make a small, controlled sound behind her that was not quite a word. Lady Miriam said, in a voice that had lost its calibration entirely, "That is not possible. The estate." "The estate," James said, in the particular tone of a man who has spent his life being addressed as Your Grace, and no longer requires any external signal of his standing to speak in it, "is under my management. The eviction notice, as I understand it, was issued without the knowledge of the trustees." He looked at Fenwick. "I have been in correspondence with the firm of Hartwell and Green. They are in agreement." Fenwick had the expression of a man watching a floor he was certain was solid develop a visible crack. He looked from James to Lady Miriam, and then at the gravel drive with the focused attention of someone wishing fervently to be elsewhere. "I received a letter last week," James continued, still in that measured, undecorated tone, "from a tenant of the Ashford estate reporting a situation on the property that required personal attention. I came to understand it myself." He looked at Eleanor. She held his gaze. The morning light was fully up now, spreading clear and cold across the garden, and behind her the roses along the south wall were the most particular red she had ever seen them, and she was standing in the doorway of the cottage she had made over 4 years into the shape of a life. And James Hartwell, Earl of Ashford, was looking at her as though she were the only fixed point on the drive. "Your letter to the trustees," he said quietly, "arrived at their office this morning, forwarded from the county post. I have not read it. It was addressed to them, and I sent it on unopened." He paused. "Though I know what it argues because I have seen the Blackstone on your desk, and I know how you think." She did not speak. "Your widow's portion is secured," he said. "The occupancy clause will be reviewed by the trustees this fortnight, and it is my opinion that it will be found sufficient. Fenwick's notice has no standing." Lady Miriam had gone the particular colour of a woman who has discovered, in front of the witnesses she was relying on to ratify her authority, that the ground beneath that authority was not ground at all. She looked from Eleanor to James and then to Fenwick with an expression that had shed all its composed certainty, and was now doing the thing that composed certainty, stripped of its material supports, must inevitably do. "This is," she said, and stopped. "This is entirely unprecedented." "It may be," James said with a courtesy that was perfectly genuine and entirely without softness. "Nevertheless, it is the case." Whitmore, who had been following this exchange from his position near the gatepost, with the widening attention of a man who had stumbled into something considerably more interesting than the social call he had planned, had the grace to look at his horse's mane for a moment. Agnes, behind Eleanor, exhaled very slowly, and the sound of it was almost ceremonious. Lady Miriam looked at Eleanor one final time, and Eleanor looked back at her with the quiet, level regard she had given her for 5 years, through the length of her marriage and the 18 months of her widowhood, through the morning calls and the drawing-room verdicts and the arrangements she had been invited to participate in without being given the option of refusal. She did not perform the look. She simply returned it, as she had always returned it, with the plain decency of someone who has decided that how you look at people is one of the things that belongs to you regardless of what they take. Lady Miriam turned very deliberately and walked back toward her carriage. Fenwick followed. He paused once and looked back at James with an expression that contained an entire professional reckoning, and then continued to the carriage without speaking. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel is a particular sound, all its own. It has a weight and a rhythm, and a small diminishing quality as it reaches the gate and turns onto the lane, and Eleanor listened to it until it was gone. And then the morning was quiet. Whitmore cleared his throat. "I shall," he said, "perhaps call another time." He mounted his horse with considerable dignity and considerable speed, and guided it back down the drive without further ceremony. Agnes went inside without being asked, which was her way of giving Eleanor a space she had not requested, but would need. Eleanor stood at the front door of the cottage with the morning fully around her, the air cold and clean with the smell of last night's rain still in it, and the roses on the south wall holding their colour as they had held it through every morning of the 4 years she had tended them, and James Hartwell, standing on the drive, looking at her with the expression she had been unable to name since the library. She named it now. "You came because of a letter from a tenant," she said. "From Agnes Pratt," he said. "She wrote to the estate office in September. She described the situation clearly." Eleanor absorbed that for a moment. She thought of Agnes at the kitchen table with the week's accounts. Agnes setting the bread down and reading her face. Agnes going to the village on her unexplained errands. Agnes, who had apparently decided in September that endurance required assistance and had not mentioned it to Eleanor because Eleanor would have asked her not to send the letter. "She did not tell me," Eleanor said. "No." There was a warmth in that single syllable that made the morning feel closer. "I do not think she thought you would permit it." "I wouldn't have," Eleanor said honestly. He walked up the front path, and when he reached the step below the threshold, he stopped, and they were at eye level with each other, and the distance between them was the width of the doorway, and the considerable width of everything that had not yet been spoken. "The 2 days," Eleanor said. "You were watching." "I was," he said. He did not elaborate immediately, but she could see that he intended to. "I had heard something of the Voss estate situation before I arrived. I had heard through the county correspondence of an eviction notice and a widow's claim and a very organised set of accounts. I did not know what I would find." He looked at the roses and then back at her. "You offered me tea on the first morning without asking my name or my rank. You told me about the guttering because you thought I should know the truth of the property. You made tea yourself in your own kitchen on the second morning and told me to sit down." A pause. "You stayed." "It is my home," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know." The cottage was at her back. The library with the Blackstone, the kitchen with the kettle, the garden with the roses that had no interest in the season's opinion. The sitting room where she had kept the accounts through 18 months of solitude. The writing desk where she had lit a candle at 11 o'clock the night before and made the argument she had to make, regardless of who was listening. "The letter to the trustees," she said. "I wrote it before I knew." "I know that too," he said. The morning light was the colour of a decision settling into place, pale gold through the last of the autumn cloud, and James Hartwell, Earl of Ashford, was standing on the step below her threshold, looking at her the way the library had always deserved to be looked at, as though the contents of the room were considerable and the reader had arrived intending to stay. Eleanor stepped back from the doorway, not retreating, inviting. "Agnes will have put the kettle on again," she said. He stepped across the threshold. Behind him, the roses held their colour in the morning light, stubborn and steady, the deep red of something planted with bare hands that had decided to take root, regardless of the season, regardless of the arrangement, regardless of anyone's opinion of its prospects. Agnes appeared in the kitchen doorway at the end of the hall, with the expression of a woman who had been right about a great many things, and had the patience not to say so. She looked at the two of them standing in the cottage hall, Eleanor with her plain grey dress and her composed face, and everything she had defended through the length of this third morning still entirely intact, and James with his insufficient coat and his considerable stillness, and his hand just now, resting on the doorframe as though he had arrived at something he intended to stay in. Agnes looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Agnes. "Tea, I think," Eleanor said. Agnes turned back to the kitchen without another word, and the sound of her moving in there, the familiar percussion of the cottage's ordinary morning, was the warmest sound Eleanor had heard in 18 months.